You will kill me for saying this, but I like Genshin better than Breath of the Wild. Some of that is probably Stockholm Syndrome. It depends. It depends on whether the Zelda team takes a lot of lessons from old Zelda and puts them into new Zelda. I think a lot of the reason why Tears of the Kingdom has taken so long is because... That's fair. That's fair. I like Skyward Sword a lot more than most people like Skyward Sword. I will acknowledge that. I like it a lot. A lot of people don't like it a lot, but I love Skyward Sword. If nothing else, I really, really appreciated the combat. I really liked how well the combat was done, especially with the Girahim fights. How they were just pure evaluations of how good you were with the sword. I don't know. Especially given how many open world games there are these days, I can appreciate a good linear game. For me, I think the reason Tears of the Kingdom has taken as long as Breath of the Wild, maybe even longer, despite the fact that it's using the same world and the same engine, is because there have been fundamental disputes in the dev team about which path the game should take. About whether it should just totally abandon the style of old Zelda, try to go back closer to it, or try to find a third way that harmonizes quote-unquote open air, open world, and old Zelda linearity and progression. I would not be surprised if they've had to go back to the drawing board a bunch of times because they can't decide what kind of style the game should even be. Because Aonuma stated that open air was going to be every game going forward. And yeah, Breath of the Wild with good dungeons could work. Yeah, add a hookshot. Please add a hookshot. But it would really raise the question of what you define a good dungeon as. Because a lot of people, myself included, that would say that for a true Zelda dungeon, you need to get an item in it, or at least should for most of them, that lets you do something that you categorically couldn't do before. You should get a hookshot that lets you grapple at places that you couldn't grapple before. You should get a fire rod, which lets you spit fire like you couldn't before. But the closest thing to those were the runes that you get, and arguably the glider, that you get within the first hour of Breath of the Wild. Because all the champion abilities don't give you new things you couldn't do before, they just make you a little better at doing things you could already do. If they added the Dominion Rod and made it good, I would be so happy. They should add the Dominion Rod and change it so that it lets you control certain enemies. Or make it so that it starts with just statues and you can get an upgrade like you could upgrade the runes in Breath of the Wild that lets you control enemies. That would be very fun. That would exponentially increase the game's shenanigans potential. And if you want a good open world game, you need shenanigans potential. That's what I'm saying. You need shenanigans potential if you want a good open world game. So I think adding the Dominion Rod, even as much as that might have been a joke suggestion on your part, it would be a really fun way to make the game better. I don't know. Either way, I think even if they agreed that they wanted to make Breath of the Wild with good dungeons, it would raise more questions of, okay, what should the dungeon styles be? Should we have traditional dungeon items? You're so based for this one. You are legitimately incredibly based for this one. All the cane ones, the rods and the canes that do funny things. What do you think about the Cane of Samaria? Do you like the Cane of Samaria? But as I was saying, the weirder and sillier... The Cane of Samaria is the one that makes a block. It shows up, yep. It was also in A Link to the Past. But you don't get it until Turtle Rock, which is why it's easily forgotten, because Turtle Rock is generally supposed to be the penultimate dungeon of the game. Yeah, but Cane of Samaria is a fun one. I like items with unconventional uses. I like items that aren't immediately obvious as how they're supposed to use or be useful, but are still useful nonetheless. I honestly think the Cane of Samaria would be a lot more useful in an open world game like Breath of the Wild with 3D. better aiming and more importance on terrain. Because when you can only aim your bow in 4 directions, you don't really gain much from adding cover. But when you have the ability to aim pretty much anywhere, being able to summon cover anywhere you like and just snipe is honestly a really useful thing to have, and it might honestly be why they never added it to any games. Frankly, I think it's also because you need to be a lot trickier and smarter coming up with puzzles where the whole thing is add a block, maybe push it around, somewhat ironically then light something on fire to freeze something. But in terms of items that I would enjoy coming back, I would really appreciate the Cane of Somaria coming back. Just because it would... being able to summon cover with a cooldown would be a really, really fun way to make an old item which is not necessarily obviously useful and is something that could be a really, really cool tool that can become part of your moveset. Another cool item, which was kind of silly, was in Minish Cap, they had the Cane of Passy, which allowed you to flip things over. Which was very, very situational. But if they added some enemies to make it useful, or again, just pure shenanigans potential, and being able to summon a block would help with that too. Just being able to flip things over like enemies. I think maybe flipping over NPCs and buildings might be a bit too far, hard to implement, or maybe just too silly. But I think adding items where a lot of the focus is just on being fun to use and creating fun interactions would be nice. One thing I really didn't like about Breath of the Wild, and again, this is me elevating Genshin above Breath of the Wild again, is that after the first hour or so of Breath of the Wild, all the fun environmental interactions become kind of useless. Because stuff like bombs, exploding barrels, falling rocks, magnesis crates, their damage doesn't scale at all, but enemy health quickly gets really, really inflated. So you go from having all these fun ways to solve situations to just, and I suppose you could argue that the elemental application of the shock, fire, and ice rods, as well as their upgraded versions, adds something kind of like that later in the game. But, it's not environmental, it's just more weapons to use, and weapons that break really fast, and it's discouraging from actually using them, as compared to interacting with the environment to solve combat problems in interesting ways. But for better or worse with Genshin, stuff like exploding barrels and burning grass does scale, and for what it's worth, using burning grass is not really a way to kill things, but at the very least, exploding barrels remain pretty useful if you see them as a way to kill enemies. I use them relatively often, and it forces me to take stock of the environment and combat encounters where they're present. All in all, I think calling Genshin a Breath of the Wild clone would be uncharitable. I would call it a game that was aware of Breath of the Wild and tried to improve on a lot of Breath of the Wild's minor flaws to make it a better game. One of those, at least in my opinion, is narrative, that Genshin is a lot more interesting and morally complex setting. Because the whole deal with the Fatui is that people who say they're just villains or just heroes miss the whole point. Because the point of the Fatui, and arguably even the Abyss Order, maybe even Celestia, even though we don't know enough about them, is that they're groups with good intentions, sympathetic backstories, and understandable reasons for action, who nevertheless go way too far and become unsympathetic through their course of action. That the Fatui, their whole deal is they're trying to rebel against heaven because for reasons unclear to us, whenever any civilization grows too powerful, Celestia nukes them. And again, we have no idea why, but the Fatui are understandably not happy about this, so their goal is to basically blow up heaven so that it doesn't happen again. But then they go and experiment on children and wage war and do creepy espionage stuff, which makes them a complex set of characters, and this is done on purpose. But with Zelda as a whole, you don't really have those kinds of interesting moral dilemmas. And when they do pop up, it's usually by accident or ignorance. The devs are generally not, as far as I can tell, trying to make interesting characters with morally grained, complex backstories. It's just that through writing, people who are supposed to be all good heroes and people who are supposed to be all evil villains, kind of thoughtlessly and poorlessly, they make the heroes less sympathetic than they're supposed to be and the villains more sympathetic than they're supposed to be. Like, for example, they're supposed to be like, oh yeah, Ganondorf is unjust and OT, he's just a thief, power hungry, trying to rebel. But in the end, most of the information regarding the Hyrulean Civil War, which is a war event that happens right before Ocarina of Time, and is the reason that Link shows up in the Kokiri Forest and has no parents, is a war in which Hyrule conquered the Gorons, the Zora, and the Gerudo. That Ganondorf is ultimately the leader of a people who are, to a certain extent, under occupation. And to a certain extent, it makes Hyrule a colonial power, and Ganondorf to be, at least without an evaluation of his actions, the events, to theoretically be a freedom fighter. And again, this game came out in, 1999, where people didn't really think of games as being art or even having the potential to be art. But it is interesting to think back on the narrative and the set of characters and the lore setting today and think they could have done something interesting and more complex. And for all of Genshin's faults, I appreciate that it's trying to make an interesting and more complicated narrative.